Our next presenter is Dr. David Monianye, and he is the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. He will speak on Africa and China at the United Nations. And he has requested permission to stand, and I'm debating whether or not I'll let him do it.
I'll sit.
No,
I'll sit.
definitely you can stand.
Sure.
Feel free.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. It is a great honor to be here. This is home for me. I spent a great deal of my life as a young man toying and lecturing and involved in quite a number of initiatives. And I come back here with that strong feeling of belonging. However, I'm on the other side of town, down a university that we used to call a glorified high school during our days as students. It's no more, it's no longer that. It has completely changed. It's a force in its own right. However, let me start to say a few things. Unfortunately, I have to speak on China, which seems to be everyone these days is an expert on China. It has to do with the changing nature of global power. My starting point is that before we look at group area studies and things like that, and my brother, far end, elder brother, yourself, you asked a question that should be my starting point. With due respect, John Stramler and Gilbert, my supervisors and leaders are here. On the shelves of Wits University, there is a center, and if you go to international relations, you'll see it with the clear board, CAIR, Center for Africa International Relations. It is dead. Therefore, actually, there's no need for some of you I can hear to really cry. Go out there, find African rich people. There are quite a number of them. There are a lot of BEs around. And try to raise money for that center. It's Center for Africa's International Relation. Before we talk about others, there is an Africa centered, and it is dead. Why? Money. Anyway, I won't say more. That's not what brought me here. I'm here as a privilege to participate in this seminar. My talk will be very brief. The introduction, the outline as you see it, the historical background. I won't stick much to what Prof has already, the Bandung Conference, looking at China-Africa relation, look at key important speeches by President Xi, one in 2015 at United Nations General Assembly rather than Security Council, and the other second most important speech which I draw your attention to, is the Davos speech that he gave in 2017. And then I would like to look briefly into the trade and investment of China in Africa, and then look at Africa-China, the relation within the UN. The starting point is that the discussions around China, around the US, around whoever other powers that we're talking about seem to be misplaced. Our starting point is that African head of states in the golden era of Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, Bouteflika came up with an idea of a NEPAD. I think go back to that and look at transformation of the OAU to AU. I think what is critical within that is that Africa needs to stand on its own. Africa needs to raise resources to develop. However, to do all this, Africa has to have strategic partnership, needs to draw on powerful partners all over the world. The US, China, Turkey, Germany, everyone, India. So all these documents are there, they're available on the internet. We're missing the point. And therefore, later on, I think we have the Agenda 2063, which is the greatest yardstick which African students, professors, media, are refusing to use that. Whoever you analyze, whether Americans or Chinese, whether they're succeeding on the African continent or not, you need to measure them against your own documents, whether they're weak or not. The African Agenda 2063. To what extent is our relationship with the US, with China, with India, Germany, or other smaller countries? Is successful or not? Is it advancing integration on the African continent? Is it halving the unemployment? Is it dealing with climate change? Is it dealing with all these issues? This is our starting point. Refuse to go into all other issues, which has nothing to do with Africa. The bulk of our discussions have nothing to do with Africa. They start in Washington, in London, in Beijing, and in Tokyo, and we run with those debates, forgetting our own debates. So my plea, even though I'm speaking on China, is to remind you that please don't forget your own documents. Don't forget your own views, regardless of the strength of those documents. Your duty is to pick them up, strengthen them. That's all what we have. Don't be defined by others. Define yourself. The UN General Secretary, the current, had this to say on China-Africa Forum when he addressed the forum itself in Beijing quite recently. He said this forum on China-Africa cooperation is an embodiment of two major priorities of the UN: to pursue fair globalization and to promote development that leaves no one behind in the context of rule-based system of international relations supported by strong multilateral institutions. Development cooperation is increasing based on two mutually compatible roadmaps: the United Nations 2030, which has been mentioned here, Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the Africa Union's Agenda 2063. This is the UN Secretary General, the current, a much more sober compared to the previous one. Yeah, I know that diplomats, and anyway, I'm in an academic platform. China-Africa, the starting point is China-Africa's relation goes beyond the arrival of Europeans on the African continent. We all know that. There's absolutely nothing new in terms of our relationship with the Chinese. But the formal relationship goes back to 1955 at Bandung, where the Chinese were there. I think where Africa, Asia decided to unite at a time of the Cold War, at a time of a UN that itself was divided with two superpowers, then the Soviet Union and US. And the discussion was, to what extent can Africa deal, or Europe deal with racism? I think that was the core, issues of racism. How do we deal with racism? How do we deal with cooperation among developing countries? To what extent can we restructure the UN to ensure that it becomes fairer? Institutions of global governance, to what extent can we work on them to ensure that we also, as we Africans and Asians, are part to it? Because that world of a post-1945 remains so. It's unfair, it's undemocratic. As we speak, we are not here to celebrate, we are here to bury the UN. The UN is in name, otherwise it is going down, particularly at this juncture, where those who are even the bigger powers, the so-called victors, are no longer interested in the UN. The US is pulling from each and every multilateral, including the WTO. They've already given notice. The human rights, the Palestinian-Israeli, the Sudan, the Saudis are bombing Yemen out of existence, killing women, children, while we watch, we all watch. No one is speaking for Yemen. No one is speaking for Africa, as Professor Gilbert has mentioned. And therefore, the bigger question we ask is, do we need a structure that is there in name, but it does not discharge its original aim, which is to bring peace and security? However, I maintain that we still need, even though it's a deformed UN, we have nothing else to work with. Things might change. We need to work. We have no choice, particularly as Africans. We have no choice other than to democratize the system. We have the non-alignment movement. We went through the Tito, not Tito, our minister, Tito, and all other leaders, Egyptians and Kenneth Kaunda, the Indians, were very vocal in the 60s and 70s. Things have changed. There is no clear cut who is our friend and who is not. And if anyone tells you that certain countries are our best friend, you have to think twice. At this stage, we are on our own. It's an issue-based world order we are in. It's depend with what issue. If it's climate, who is our friend on climate? If it's poverty alleviation, we need to identify who is that friend we can work with. Therefore, we have no choice to look east, west, or anywhere. We need to look 360 degrees and have friends, draw them to our own strategic objectives as defined by the Agenda 2063. This relation, China-Africa, is vital for Africa's prosperity, South-South solidarity, and North-South. It is important for Africa, which China is #1 trading partner. We all know that. Important to China, which accounts why China is important. 15% of global trade at the moment, of the global economy, and 37% of developing markets, but also seeking more active strategic partner as well as a greater role in Africa. While the dynamics of China's engagement with Africa are changing, it has begun to build direct and indirect business linkages with the African continent. On those speeches that I've mentioned of President Xi, I think those speeches were made in a context where US is losing its leadership role. It has nothing to do with China or Russia or the noise that we hear. The crisis of US, as we look at from as outsiders, it is a rot that is coming from within the US itself. And it's nothing new. All other empires collapsed, Rome or any other. It was because of the system rotting from within. And that is to do with endless fights where the Democrats and Republicans see each other as enemies, and the systems of governance are collapsing. The center is no longer holding in Washington, and it reflected at a global level. The US is unable to underwrite things that it had promised the world in 1945. Unless that changes, it might change, but we don't know. But the current US that is no longer the US of 1945 or 1980, that I was excited as a youth, dancing to Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, US of Africa, and the zeal of US movies, the moral power of the US and how it won the Cold War is no longer there. And if you ask most people, which country would you like to go at any given moment, US it doesn't feature in the top three because of certain events within the US itself. So President Xi comes with a different narrative. With the void of leadership at the world order, he promises the world in Davos and the United Nations that China will close the gap. Whether he's right or wrong, history will judge him at a later stage. But he has promised that China will play a critical role. It wants a world order in which no one power dominates the world. It wants a multipolarity world order. And it is within that context that some of the utterances of President Xi, they go back to 1955, that there is a need for transformation of the United Nations, there is a need for poverty alleviation, and of transforming most of these institutions, even though Africa differs with China when it comes to transformation, particularly of the United Nations Security Council. China is our greatest friend, but it does not move an inch in terms of accommodating Africa having membership within the United Nations Security Council. It has nothing to do with Africa. It's more to do with India and Japan, that China appears not interested of those two countries to be members of the United Nations Security Council. So it is in a quagmire. As much as it wants Africa to be within the United Nations Security Council, it seems not wanting its greatest neighbor and its archival competitor, Japan. This one looks at some of the investments in Africa. There has been a lot of noise about debt trap, looking at Zambia and quite a number of countries. I really don't buy most of what is in the media. The issue of credit debt trap, it's nothing new. At the end of the Second World War, the United States had the Marshall Plan. It marshaled one of the greatest in the tune of 800 billion in today's current money to Europe, to some of the poorest countries in Europe. And those countries were able to recover, to reconstruct their economy, particularly infrastructure. It's important for us to look at that China is coming with One Belt, One Road. It's investing massively on the African continent. It's not a perfect setting. There are a lot of issues that our regulatory framework as sovereign states on the African continent is not in good shape. Corruption is a huge issue, including in our own country, that we need to look into. We tend to be pointing to China instead of pointing to ourselves. We need Chinese money. It's the only place where money is. There's no money in Washington or in London. Money is in Beijing. At the moment, things might change. But that's the real view that I have. Therefore, I think we need to look into ourselves. To what extent do we enter into negotiation with China, India, any other country to advance our own interests? But when we look at the debt that Africa has with external powers, China's debt, it's the smallest you can ever think of. It's 2% compared to Western countries. And the idea that there's a debt trap all of a sudden, it's misplaced. And therefore there is a need for students to really study and see who do we really owe money. And all this debt, have we paid it or not? What are the terms? Are these debts we signed, our head of state signed previously, are these debts transparent? The view is that they're not. And when we point to China, say, you need to put all the debts in the open, let's be fair. Let's put all debts in the open, whether the Chinese or Americans. And therefore, my view is the entire debate and the generation of news is not emanating from Africa. We are going back to the Cold War era, where the Cold War was much fought on our soil, and we should not allow the coming, and I might say, declare, perhaps the economic Cold War is here. It has arrived. Let's avoid that economic Cold War to be fought on the African continent. We have more to lose. It is not our battle. We have to choose our battles quite carefully as Africans. And therefore, when we are analyzing this, we have to be very serious. And I'm not saying there are no issues with China. There are quite a lot of issues that we need to raise. There is a forum, head of states. At times we don't trust our head of states, but we need to raise those issues fairly and let be evidence-based than speculating in a propaganda way, advancing interests which have nothing to do with the continent. These are some of the investments. I'm not going to it in the interest of time, Chair. A look at China-Africa trade relation reviews significant achievements. Those are from Kenya, and I'm going there tomorrow. The Mombasa, Nairobi, it's a success story. We have Djibouti, Ethiopia, in Nigeria, there are quite a lot of rail If we go back to NEPAD, these were the issues which were raised by our head of states. We need to be able to move our goods, our people, our culture, and our languages much faster and increase the trade among ourselves from only sheer 12% to above 50%. We need to trade among ourselves. And therefore, infrastructure, hard infrastructure, physical infrastructure will assist us to trade among ourselves and ensure that we become less dependent on other. We cannot have Chinese next 50 years building our roads and dams, and we have to theaters such as this have experts who can service all this stuff that are being built by the Chinese or Americans for that matter. In Kenya, for instance, while the Chinese were developing a rail, the Americans were developing a road. And these two infrastructure running parallel. So let's really be very clear that there is a competition, and let's use the leverage we have. This is a golden opportunity. I mean, I understand my own supervisor, PhD supervisors who are here, both John and Gilbert. There is a golden opportunity where we see there's somehow our leaders are not clear. We are not speaking, but let's look at the competition between the US and China as a golden opportunity. Let us celebrate that big powers are leaving Africa. That's what we need, because that will force us to generate knowledge and work hard and take advantage of the competition to our advantage in terms of trading. There is much more. If I want to build a rail from here to Cape Town and Durban and Messina, border with Zimbabwe, on the loans in terms of capital on the market, there's a lot of countries. It's no longer going to Washington alone as we used to do a few years ago. We only had to go to Washington because that's the only place where money was, or London. These days, you either go to Turkey or you go to Japan or London, Washington, and you end up being in Beijing. I think that's where the deal will be signed. Yes, I'm rounding off, Chair. So there are quite a lot of issues that we need to discuss, that China, Africa agree more within United Nations. There is a massive disagreements between China and the US. But when you look at resolution within United Nations, there are new phenomena where China is asserting itself. For the very first time, China is starting to write resolutions, something which is unique. China used to watch other countries write resolution, and it only vote advancing its own interest. These days, China is now writing resolutions. And South Africa is going to be, for 2 years, and quite a number of other African countries, through the AU, there is a need for an Africa consolidated position to avoid another Libya. In Libya, you had Chinese building roads. United States and European countries came and bombed the country and killed the leader. Libya is in a worse situation than before. I know I disagree with John on this one. We were better with Gaddafi. Gaddafi, we look at him today, he's much more of a liberator than a dictator he was. And we have to avoid a situation in which, whether it's Pretoria in Nigeria, support resolutions that are against the continent. We have to unify, we have to protect the sovereignty of the continent, and we can only do that if we are united, as you all have said. I have more things to say, but the chair is looking at me.
I am.
Yes, and I'm going to have a lot of recommendations, but I think some of these things can come in the question and answer session.
Great.
I thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
So we will take questions and comments, and can we keep them succinct and to the point? Sir?
Probably one of the most strategically endowed countries, Malaysia, strategically, has just re-elected Mahathir back at the age of 93. And the first thing Mahabir has done was to say to China, denounce the major projects that have been signed by his predecessor, and has started looking at China warily. What is South Africa's position? Is that an acceptable, wary position that South Africa should look at as a kind of neo-colonialism of sorts? Should we be worried about China?
You want to take a seat?
Sure.
Okay. We'll take a few more questions from the floor, and then David will respond. Sir?
Thank you, Chair Person. Morning, Dr. Munyai. Thanks so much for your intensive discussion here. I'll be brief, although I've got a lot of questions.
But you will be brief.
Okay. Yes. Don't you think perhaps the trade war between the US and China is perhaps fueled by the fact that China is coming with what we just mentioned here, the One Rail, One Road initiative, which seems to be China is going to capture the whole world. So don't you think perhaps it's because of that? Because recently we just heard Mr. Trump was saying China must devalue its currency, and China is resisting from that. Thank you.
John?
Oh, just quickly, David, because I liked your last comments that reminded me that there doesn't have to be a Cold War, and that in the Obama administration on the Green Climate Fund, there was important cooperation between China and the U.S. for the benefit of Africa in climate mitigation. Today, there is still a project that I started at the Carter Center for China, Africa, U.S. win-win-win, and they may be coming to South Africa in December. It involves Ambassador Zhang, who was ambassador here, and now is a special representative for GE for Africa. Princeton Lyman died, so Don Booth is replacing him, and then former Minister of Ethiopia, Messam, is going to be doing the African connection. There have been practical cooperation in piracy addressing, and in the Gulf of Guinea, and and across the band of instability in the north, where the Chinese and the Americans, despite Trump, have nevertheless managed to find some practical solutions. Do you see any promise in that?
Let me start with yes, John. There's quite a lot of areas. There's something that is called trilateral, where I was privileged, other than being at Wits, I spent a great deal of time at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA. And I was in charge of the UNGA Dam in the DRC. So I can tell you that I think with Baby Kabila leaving, we're not sure whether the new president is going to continue with the agreements that were signed. The dam, if it must come out, it is needed, it's the missing gap in terms of our own development. The Ethiopians have built their own, the Grand Renaissance Dam from their own money. Each and every Ethiopian was taxed to develop that dam. So a Spanish company and Chinese won the deal combined. And that's one of the views that I always say, that the elephant is huge, the continent is quite huge. China on its own cannot make it in Africa. There's room for Americans, there's room for British, Turkish. By the way, Turkey, with all the noise, it's quite advanced when it comes to the continent. The current president has made some inroads into the continent. As a matter of fact, the Turkish airline, it's much more bigger than SAA on the African continent. What it means that Turkish airline goes to more African destinations than SAA. And so we see all these changes. There's room to have Indians dealing with ICT, Chinese with bridges and rail, and they're good at it. Americans can come with other areas. that Africa needs. And therefore, we need to accommodate all stakeholders, as we said in the AU, with a strategic partnership, that there is room. By the way, with Britain leaving the European Union, Theresa May, other than dancing on the African continent, I think she'll need to dance much more better on other key issues to avoid going back to some of the Commonwealth kind of a colonial. That's a real colonial. I mean, going back to the first question, the idea that China is a neo-colonial, and I mean, it's not anchored in facts. You can't eat any threat to look at China in that light, other than just advancing one power against another. There are issues, as I said, with China. When it comes to environment, the Chinese ambassador has made it quite clear. The Chinese nationals, not the state, who are involved in deals that are terrible, who are poaching our rhinos, and including ourselves, not only Chinese. We're working with them in these crimes. Our laws are a bit soft. We need to lock them up. I think that's the only issue we need to do. So there are issues on any other in terms of deals that, like Americans, they come here to make money. And for us to think that they're coming here as our friends to help us, there's no free lunch in town. So let's be realistic as Africans and see them for what they are. They are traders like any other in a capitalist system, not any other system that we're dealing with. Matia, whom I like dearly, we tend to have this headline news and we run with it without following up. Matia, when he came into power, now, at 80 or 90 years old? 93, oh Lord. Or it's something else. That's a leverage that he used. He is not anti-China at all. Most people are running around with that headline, which is misplaced. He is not going to cancel the deals. He is using the previous deals to renegotiate the deals, to get a better deal from China. And he's going to get it. And while we're busy making noise around, same applies with the Zambia question. Most of what we hear, it's not true. However, Zambia has debt problems. So we need to be quite careful. I think for South Africa, it's the same issue. We are in big trouble at the moment. Whether VAT is going up again with the new finance minister, we don't have resources. We have a lot of infrastructure to build. There's no money. When we go on the capital market, we need to ask questions, where are we going to get simple issues if you are in the finance section? Where are we going to get cheap capital? That's the big question as a leader. And how are we going to get debt for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, at what rate? These are simple questions that we need to have. But we can't just blame our head of states if VETS does not produce technical skills to be able to help our principals in striking these deals. It's not just a head of state's problem. It's a systemic problem we have, that we don't have the skills, which are supposed to come from our institutions of higher learning, all of them, not only picking up VETS. So we have to be very serious in what we do and say, and raise particularly the question of corruption. Very hard on our people. I have a column in Pretoria News, and the last 2-3 weeks I've been writing about corruption. And I'm thinking my next column should be corruption again. We have to be hard on our leaders. China has our leaders, chair, go to China, not only as at a government-to-government level, at a party level. I've been to that school in China where our head of states, where I was told, the chair you're sitting in, so a head of state was seated there last week. They go there. You just wonder what they're learning in China. The Chinese are locking up mayors, premiers, ministers. They're being locked up. There's a policy called catch tigers and flies, which means a traffic cop who's asking for a drink and a minister with VBS will lock them up equally. You don't choose. So we have to be serious of poverty alleviation, youth unemployment. And we're not serious at the moment. We have all these shows, Zondo Commission and all this television stuff. We're wasting time. We need to lock some of these people. That's the only way that we have to be serious. We don't have a hanging system. In China, they hang. We're democratic. So my lasting parting shot, Chair, is that we have a golden opportunity that we are advancing democracy while liberal democracy is dying in the West. We are advancing two issues that we are faced with. Democracy does not reside in a ballot box. Democracy resides in the stomach. So I'm cutting all stuff that I've learned. I realize some of this is useless knowledge. Measure democracy by the level of how full your stomach is. Is your kid going to school? As simple as that. That's how we need to measure our democracy. Is our road, is it having potholes? Is crime an issue? Am I breathing fresh air? These are simple ways of measuring democracy. If we don't have that, we don't have democracy. So let us not run all these election queues and whatever. I'm not against elections. I am pro-elections. But what I'm saying, let us not advance one-dimensional democracy. I see my supervisor shocked that I'm advancing the ballot box and the stomach, where there's an equilibrium between the two. That's how we measure democracy. And as Africans, neither Beijing nor Washington, Addis Ababa and Pretoria need to advance our well-being as we choose friends all over the world. Thank you.
I'm going to take one last question from the back. Yes, please.
Thank you for taking my question. Dr. Munya, your last slide looked like it was touching on for the fourth industrial revolution,
Yes.
Right? So what I'm really particularly interested in is what lessons we can learn from China, whether it's, or what sort of active participations or active relationships that we're kind of leaving on the table and not talking about, whilst, you know, like you're talking, like you mentioned, everyone's looking at headlines and worrying about debt traps. You know, when President Cyril Ramaphosa invited Jack Ma to set up a digital skills school here in South Africa, I kind of got the sense that, you know, firstly, what is a digital skills school? I got the sense that there's no one really in our government, or when it comes to our government, there are no adults in the room taking care of, worrying about, and planning for that fourth industrial revolution, taking the time to thoroughly understand it, to create the relevant infrastructure for, you know, work skills in the future, the relevant infrastructure, for instance, a digital economy. You've got the Malaysian instance where they've got an MDEC, which is the Malaysian digital economy. It's a corporation, right? So it's all government implementing stuff. But, you know, for our president to invite an entrepreneur to come to a whole country to set up a skills school, a digital skills school, kind of sounds like Jack Ma's going to just teach us how to sell stuff on Alibaba, on Taobao and JD, and how to blog and, you know, put up nice posts. But the future of work in African economies is so much bigger than that. Where are those public-private initiatives? Because right now, the Singularity Conference is taking place. So you've got corporates talking to other corporates, you've got entrepreneurs and venture capitalists talking to each other, but where is government in that whole ecosystem, whether it's regulatory frameworks, etc.? Who understands this and who's taking care of this, who gets this, and who's plumbing China's ideas for how to go forward?
Would you please identify yourself?
Oh, my name's Refilo Mpakanyane. I am a media practitioner.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I propose that the study of America studies and China project and India project, all combined, could work with the Confucius Institute on a joint major seminar, precisely on the point you have made. We can have a major conference on that,
On the topic of the fourth
for
revolution.
fourth industrial revolution and Africa's position, Africa's way forward. I think it's quite an interesting area that we need to explore. Africa at the moment, we are not yet even in the third industrial revolution. We haven't met, we haven't reached that stage. The world is moving fast. With all this noise from White House about China and trade, Donald Trump, I mean, forget about the deficit issue, 300 plus. That's not the real issue. Behind Donald Trump's madness in terms of, my apology, I say this in a positive way, about China deficit, it's just an iceberg. The real issue, the real core elephant in the room is China's so-called Made in China 2025. You go and read about it. What it means that US hegemony is under threat. What made US its leadership in technology advancement. As we speak, we are not really sure who is the head of technological advancement. It's no longer US. Europe is advancing, Japan is advancing. China is alarming, advancing at an alarming stage. And the only continent that is left out is ours. We are nowhere to be seen. And therefore, if you are scared of being recolonized, this should be the real concern that Africans need to think seriously about. Not China trade, I mean, rails, Mombasa, Nairobi stuff. It is this fourth industrial revolution. It's going to make us sheer people watch what's going on, and we're going to really suffer. Therefore, we need to take advantage of the comparative advantage we have. If you go to Kenya, Kenya is leading on, is it Mombasa? This where you can send money easily. Yeah, M-Pesa. There's quite a lot of advancement, IT on the African continent, in small ways. South Africa is not a small player. It is quite a huge player. That's why I get so worried with these MTN stories in Nigeria. We have to unite as Africans. What made China advance to this level, even Japan for that matter, all the countries we call that tiger economies, it's a basic issue. I think, madam, what is needed is we need to send as many students from the continent to China, to Japan, to United States, to Germany, to learn what is happening in those countries. Learn as much as you can, then come back to the continent to advance. At the moment, we're not taking advantage offers from the US, from China. China is advanced in terms of the numbers of scholarship it is giving. That's where the competition we want these countries to engage, by giving more scholarship to our young youth. Not just scholarship in every kind of area, but in key strategic areas of technology, nuclear, areas of going to space. There's a huge debate, Prof has left, on India. Why is India so fascinated about going to space? By the way, India is in the top 3 on space issues. While some Indians are dying of hunger, I mean, poverty in India, it's worse in certain areas, worse than Africa. I've been there. And we have to do the same. We need to advance our space studies, even though we're poor. And we can't choose that we need just to feed ourselves without attempting to go to space. So I leave you with that kind of view that the fourth industrial revolution should be our daily, everything we do need to focus on that, including the kind of lessons, because we're still schooling our students on subjects and discipline of the last century, which are irrelevant, including IR, my own field. I don't see how relevant it is today, because we're going to have robots we're going to generate, a better IR than us. So we have to think seriously, not think the way we were during my days. And therefore, I think they challenge the younger students to focus and positioning Africa with the fourth industrial revolution in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the entire morning panelists for their participation and for stimulating our discussion. Can we give everyone a hand, please? So we are going to move on to our topic on Africa and global power partnerships for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this will be kicked off by Bob. Thank you very much. And he is a lecturer in journalism and media studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for turning up for this event, this forum. As the Chair mentioned, my presentation is focused on a much more practical and pragmatic area of interest, which is how do we kick out poverty from the continent by entering into partnerships with the so-called global powers, in which case then we go beyond just the US, China, India, and look at other global powers. I think we are all familiar, and it's become a sort of cliche to kind of mention that in September 2015, the world came together under the umbrella of the UN to set up what we have now come to call SDGs, or Strategic Development Goals, also known as the Global Agenda or Agenda 2030. And that by 2030 we should have overcome certain areas of poverty as stated in the 17 goals, 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 169 targets. So this is a promulgation that was made in September 2015. This year at the 73rd United Nations General Assembly, we were indeed celebrating 3 years since the launch or the inauguration of the SDGs. So it is indeed a fact that time is actually moving pretty fast, because now it's already 3 years down the line. The SDGs were launched in January 2016, and thereafter in January 2019, we shall actually be looking back to 3 years. It's a time to review, so how time flies. And as we go towards the 2030 deadline for the achievement of these 17 goals, we realize that now we have only 12 years to go. And 12 years is a very short period of time. If you want to look at it in a certain way, an undergrad at Wits, who is 20 years today, will be 32. At a time when someone at 32 will be figuring out if their career path is on the right path or it has veered off track. So 12 years not too far back. In a sense, the strategic development goals, the so-called global agenda or the 2030 agenda, is an agenda for Africa. If you look at the launch document, you find that it's really focused on extreme poverty. And it is a fact of life that extreme poverty exists on this continent much more than elsewhere, although pockets of Asia also do have levels of extreme poverty. So in fact, I will urge you that if you have a moment, although now it's an old document, if you look at the document that is, I think, referred to as Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, for Sustainable Development, it is an interesting document because over it you will see that Africa is written into almost every 2 or 3 paragraphs in terms of Africa needing to overcome extreme poverty. I think I've mentioned that to a great extent the global agenda is an agenda for Africa, because unfortunately, even though we might be here feeling confident about ourselves and feeling that Africa is a rising continent and so forth, it gives no level of confidence to say that we are we're actually the poorest, part of the planet. And so the question is, what do we do to overcome our poverty? And this is where we come in with the potential for partnerships. Of the 17 goals that the UN has set up, the 17th goal is perhaps the most important one, because it talks about the creation of partnerships for implementation of the other 16 goals. Yet, if you look at the United Nations General Assembly that was held recently, you realize that there was very little focus on goal number 17, which is partnerships. There's much more focus on goal number 1, poverty, ending poverty, or a goal such as goal number 4, education for all, and so forth. And in fact, coming from a media and communications department, partnerships is actually critically important because also, as we see, media plays the role of publicizing, mobilizing, and connecting people, providing the information. Similarly, as we look at a review of how the SDGs have been implemented so far, we see very little in the way of what role the media can play. In fact, in our field, there are very few studies looking at implementation of SDGs, except perhaps by, Faxon Banda, who is a UNESCO scholar who has done something along those lines. I think it's also worth pointing out that we need to create partnerships because the UN itself is hamstrung in a sense. The UN is not, it might be the implementer of some of the projects and programs, but the UN is much more of a facilitator, a body that kind of monitors what the 192 countries are doing, rather than actually barging in a major way. The budgets and the finances come from individual countries, which is why then Africa needs to position itself to look at which partnerships can be created with the assistance of the facilitative role of the UN. I think if we look at the UN as this big body that is going to give us billions of shillings to sort out our educational interests, to end poverty on the African continent, we'll be looking in the wrong way. However, the SDGs provide an opportune platform through which we can actually structure some deals, so that we are perhaps able to overcome what Tony Blair, I think, if I recall well, called this, Africa being the scar on a human's conscience, which is a terrible thing. As Africans, we need to feel terrible that we are considered a scar on the world's conscience, right? So as such, we have to look at SDGs and identify which countries to work with in which respects. And I'm happy that my senior, Dr. Munyae, and who is becoming very soon, I'm told, Professor Munyae, so that I can properly take the position of doctor, as he moves up, as he moves up the ladder. I think he did allude to the, idea that Africa cannot really be boxed into a relationship with just one country. We need to be eclectic, and if eclectic seems like a difficult word, we need to, look everywhere, and rather than just focusing on China or the US or Europe or India, and indeed, as someone mentioned, Malaysia, Singapore, and so forth. What can we get from who, and to help with what? In fact, in some respect, some of the SDGs, of the 17 SDGs, some of them have nothing to do with us. Particularly, if you look at goal number 12, which talks about sustainable consumption and production. Sustainable consumption and production patterns. Now, consumption is essentially eating, like what we've done over the coffee break. Now, I think Africa doesn't have a problem with consumption. In terms of we do not have problems with our digestive systems. It is that we do not have the food to put in our mouths in the first place. So I think goal number 12, where we are seeing issues of obesity in the US or unhealthy eating habits, or people just parking on their couches and watching TV for the whole day. In many African, villages, we don't have radios to start with, not to talk about TV. So goal number 12, for example, is not our problem. And so we should actually almost lobby for it to be expunged from the SDGs. So I think I'll just go back again to just say, look, on the face of it, goal number 17 looks like a goal that we should not, on the face of it, looks like it's a useless goal, but it's an important one because it calls for the creation of partnerships. If you look at the structure of the SDG document, it has at least several pillars. And one is that it's focused on people, it is focused on peace, it's focused on partnerships, and it's focused on the planet and prosperity. Again, as with goal number 12, my argument is that as Africans, our interests will be much more to do with the people, because it's our aunties, our grandmothers, and so forth who are suffering, almost, various aspects of poverty. We should also focus on peace, because places such as South Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya, Somalia, and so forth are ill at ease. And as Kwame Nkrumah said, to paraphrase him, if one part of Africa is in trouble, the rest of the continent can't be at peace. Equally, the idea of a partnership, as I've repeatedly said, is important. However, two pillars to me do not necessarily make a lot of sense. They might be important, but they are of less importance. And this is focus on the planet. You want to focus on the entire world, the planet, when you have, kind of harnessed your immediate environment to sustain you. So in our case, we have not yet harnessed our farmland to provide enough food. So how do we start then looking at the planet in its entirety? So while things like the ozone layer are of critical importance, including here at Wits, where we have people studying the ozone layer, for someone in a village in Western Kenya, the immediate concern is not the ozone layer. It is, am I going to get my meal this afternoon or not? So that pillar for me is important for people, high up there, but not for our people. The issue of prosperity, I know, Alice is cringing, but, I'm focusing my perspective on the people on the ground. The issue of prosperity as well is for me a pillar that is important, but not of much importance to an Africa, where you have to have some level of development to talk of prosperity. We all remember Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. You start at the bottom of the pyramid where you have physiological needs, food and shelter. If we are suffering with the basics like lack of food and shelter, how can we then go to higher level of needs, which are actually like self-actualization, right? So I'll move on very quickly to go back to what I was alluding to earlier, that we can actually choose which partners to deal with on what particular sustainable development goals and areas of development and areas of kind of kicking out of poverty from the continent. And I think the metaphor of look east and look west, I think it's Uncle Bob, I'm sure now he's enjoying his retirement, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, who first coined the phrase of Africa no longer looks to the west where the sun sets, but looks to the east where the sun rises. And he was saying that when Zim was under major sanctions from the West and so forth. And I think he meant the East, not just, essentially his use of the metaphor of look East was towards China. It was towards Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth, East Asian countries. But eventually just became a metaphor for Africa looking towards China. And on the other hand, I think we can still also look to the west even if the sun is setting there. After all, sometimes we sit somewhere high up on hills and look at the sun, going down the horizon as it sets. So it's as important to look at the sun rising as well as to look at the sun setting, as it were. So goal number 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals. First of all, I should like just point out that goal number 1 for me, which is end all poverty, is rather amorphous. And it is one in which we can look everywhere and internally for ways of overcoming that. Because, you know, when you say poverty, what do you exactly mean? Which kind of poverty? It could be a poverty of ideas, in which case a person who lacks poverty of ideas just needs to come to Wits, perhaps. But it might be poverty in terms of what to eat, which then goes to goal number 2, I think, which is food security. So in terms of goal number 2 of the SDGs, and I think if this presentation helps at all, it is that we need to go to look at these, strategic development goals and interrogate them. So goal number 2 is on food security. And in terms of food security, I think we are always better off looking to the East. And with this, then I will agree with Dr. Monyae. Because in the 60s, you recall when Mao Zedong had this idea of a great leap forward, that China was just going to shoot to the top of the world in terms of industrialization. China actually ended up with lots of hunger. In fact, close to 400, is it close to, millions of people died. I suppose well over 1 million people died. So China has been a very hungry country only recently. 60 years is not long ago. But then over the past couple of years, particularly from 1980 when under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China has actually been able to feed itself, gain surplus, and start exporting. So in that respect, looking east to achieve goal number 2 of ending hunger on the African continent is feasible. Goal number 3 is about health, which is a very important area. Again, I'll suppose that we can actually look east on this. One, because you realize the Chinese have actually a very interesting approach to health. First of all, it's just good livelihood. Whether you are doing Tai Chi or, doing some of those livelihood kinds of stuff. But in addition to that, they have harnessed what they call traditional Chinese medicine. Now tell me, in our villages in Angola, in Nigeria and so forth, don't we have many, many kinds of herbs that can treat anything from malaria to, all sorts of issues to, if you have stomach cramps and so forth. Now, what the Chinese have done is that they have actually processed and are now manufacturing these traditional medicines. And therefore, we can actually look at harnessing our potential of the continent to do just exactly that. And I think India is also interesting in achieving goal number 2 because India has been able to develop a huge industry in generic medicines, even though the US is always struggling with patent issues with Indian farms. I think we can look to India in terms of developing generic drugs to help with all manner of ailments. Goal number 11 is cities, and I think I'll go to goal number 9 first, which is infrastructure and industrialization. Again, even though the US is making a comeback to the continent and other European countries are trying to make a comeback to the continent in terms of infrastructure, China has been exceptionally successful in structuring roads and actually funding them and so forth. As Monyae says, we need to just be careful that we do not negotiate ourselves into trouble. But if we negotiate properly and also then have knowledge transfer in terms of infrastructure development, I think the whole area of industrialization and infrastructure development looks like we can look east. And one can go on to the development of cities, and settlement. Countries such as Singapore have very little land, and yet they have made their cities very livable. It's an area, that's goal number 11, that we can borrow from them. So now I think the big thing here, therefore, is that you realize that areas in which we can perhaps look to the east are all in the economic arena, largely speaking. However, areas in which we can look to the west in achievement of sustainable development goals are more to do with the west. I will submit to us that the educational system in the west is much superior to many educational systems in the east. And I say that humbly because I studied in China, in Beijing. But even while studying in Beijing, we used books from the West, and so forth. So I would like to imagine that there's something we can borrow from the West in terms of goal number 4 on education, goal number 16 on governance and aspects of peace and security, goal number 5 on gender. Is something also we can look particularly to the Nordic countries, Northern Europe. They've been able to, treat their men and women at the same level. In fact, in terms of this particular aspect on gender, which is goal number 5, if you look at the famous pictures that we usually have of new Chinese leadership, I think this time round on the Politburo is of the Chinese, Communist Party. There's only one woman, and that's a major improvement. In the past, from Mao Zedong days, it has always been fully male, macho men, as it were. So I think it's not much we can learn from China, especially at the leadership level on matters gender. But if you go to the Nordic countries, we have had a string of ladies actually leading those countries, and that's something we can learn from. Again, in matters of governance, I think while 2 minutes. On matters of governance, I think we want to look at, even if we say the US is a very antagonistic, protagonistic, noisy democracy, but I love that kind of chaos that comes with calling Trump names and not being jailed for it. Mm-hmm. Because if Professor John Stremlow was in Beijing and he was laying into Xi Jinping, he will have just disappeared off the face of earth. So I think in terms, even from our media studies field, the Chinese journalism is not something we might want to ape, even though we study it, because it's set-piece journalism. You have to go with a certain script. Even though sometimes it's called developmental journalism, or we have, nice names like constructive journalism, or we have, nice names like peace journalism and so forth. But, the kind of journalism that calls people to account, that is of watchdog kind, might be of better interest to us. And I think I will just conclude by actually saying that partnerships are already evolving. As Wits and the centers that we are, developing, we need to actually be the institutions that develop, drive, and fund these partnerships. Just one example that perhaps we can look at working with is the, I think it's called the African Center for SDGs. Interestingly, located in Kigali, Rwanda. Now, that tells you that Paul Kagame has been very strategic in seeing the opportunity and setting up a center for the study of SDGs. I'm told now there's a new one that's going to be established in Zambia. And I think that those kinds of institutions provide opportunities for partnerships. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Bob. I am going to abuse my seat here and take you on initially with regard to the issue around the planet and the concerns that you seem to suggest that we don't need to, or it isn't as relevant to us here on the continent. You talked about the auntie in the village. But if we don't deal with issues of, and take very seriously the issues of climate change and global warming and the like, and the impact, the adverse impact that those items have on poor people in particular, and developing countries specifically, then we will all be baked. And it's something that we, as a continent and as individual countries, we have to be concerned about. It can't be dismissed. But that's in my humble opinion. And I will open it up, and then you can respond. Yes, please. Gilbert.
Thank you, Bob. I wanted to go back to the point you made earlier on there was no discussion around partnerships at this meeting that we just heard. And my question to you, therefore, is that if partnership is missing from these global conclaves, then why are you pushing the argument for more partnerships? It just didn't look, or rather, we need a good explanation to why those partnerships are not working. But the other question, the other point is, let me read you a statement from Kagame, who you have just cited. And he was talking about SDGs at the UN. He says, economies of scale and higher levels of intra-African trade will help us attain the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. I was really struck by that argument, and I'm just trying to ask you what you think about it. He says we should forget about partnerships, we just focus on intra-African trade. If we do, 2030 we'll get there.
I want to get some folk who haven't been seen yet. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Temkosi Zungu. I'm an entrepreneur and a student at MIT in data economics and policy development. There's a growing trend in terms of setting unrealistic goals, starting with the SDGs. I think currently, as far as I read, we've got a budget deficit of $252 million in order to be able to achieve the sustainable goals. Okay, and also in the point of technology and fourth industrial revolutions, we are, I think, 5 years behind. What is your views in terms of educating the society that the decision makers and the policy makers are still not on the par with the developments? And because I always find that the society is left behind. Only when it comes to close to elections, then we divert to in order to win votes, or then we forget about the goals that we've set for the past 3 years and so on. I just want to get your views on that. Thank you.
Take one more question, sir. Yes.
Okay, so thank you. For the issue of the survival of our planet, I tend to believe what Pope Francis said in his encyclical Laudato Si, that we need even to change our civilization. Capitalism must disappear because it's too anthropocentric. We tend to focus on individual profit. It's leading us nowhere. It said we need solidarity. So, are you really confident that with this capitalistic ethos, we can really guarantee the survival of our planet? Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take these questions and then do one more round.
Okay. Thanks. I think I'll start by commenting on your question, which ties in with us. I think us, I'm not. It would be nihilistic of me to even start supposing that we need to forget about the planet and all these, our challenges of our time, which like climate change, which affect everybody. I was just looking at the 4 pillars. There's peace, people, planet, and I think one other. And I was just thinking of, in relative terms, and placing myself in the shoes of someone living in the village and needing to just have the next meal. If I was to look at these 4 various pillars, which one will I focus on first? And I'm at that village level. I would say, yeah, focus on the planet, definitely. You can't dismiss it. But my immediate concern is actually to have a meal.
And you can't have a meal if your plants won't grow because climate change has affected the
so I think, you see now.
soil and the water and the access to. So all of these things are connected.
Yes, yeah, they are connected, but you can allow the presenter to take the position that
I believe that you can have You can definitely have an opinion. I just don't agree with it.
Yeah. So I think the presenter holds a very strong view that yeah, I mean, in fact, he agrees with the questioner that you can actually, planet, environment, and so forth, critical. But to start with, I have to eat today, now. And then I can worry about how that is going to affect me later. But if I'm dying, I'm dying of starvation, I might want to think of the planet 2 minutes after I've had a meal and I'm full. And that's just being pragmatic. I think with regards to partnerships and why they are not working, I think my perspective is that we have to make these partnerships work as the African Union and individual countries. And I think it is the strategic nations, such as Rwanda, for example. In fact, I mentioned the case of Kagame as an example because he is providing leadership on SDGs by creating this SDG Studies Center. Because then, subsequent to that, you'll find many corporates and universities and countries and civil societies actually basing themselves in Kigali, which is, by the way, emerging as a new center, in fact, threatening Nairobi's position that it has held for such a long time as a regional power. And further afield, threatening Johannesburg and Pretoria. So it's I think, the countries, African countries themselves that will need to make the partnerships work. I've actually watched, if we take the example of the African centers as a microcosm of what can be done, I've watched my seniors, Professor Tawana and Kajagala, actually develop partnerships from nothing. So that now we have a center running. And I think this, if taken to the level of a nation, is actually visionary leaders who will see the UN SDGs with its goals that are to be achieved by 2030, which have been agreed on by all nations and most corporations, as an opportunity to create these partnerships. I think on the other hand, there is a guilt conscience of lots of Western companies, NGOs, government, and so forth. They feel, because the underlying all these discussions is the whole issue of development. The global north, the rich north versus the poor, impoverished south. And there's always a certain level of guilt conscience on the part of North America and Europe, because their people are well-fed and well-read and well taken care of in terms of health, and yet people are dying in the global south, particularly Africa, on the basis of very mundane, innocuous kinds of diseases. So I think a smart African leader or leaders can actually create partnerships by harping on that guilt, going to them and to these corporations, be it Apple or Coca-Cola or whatever, and telling them, look, you need to support us because you can't be fattening, and we are, getting emaciated every single day to our death. Okay, so intra-Africa trade as proposed by Kagame, I will say, I think Kagame might have, I'm not too sure where he was coming from, but I would want to imagine that he has a point. Because we usually say that Africa's involvement in global trade is just about 12%, and as a whole. And internal trade between countries is even much smaller. Africans essentially do not trade with themselves. And these are 54 countries, the second biggest landmass on earth, continent that has a huge youth bulge and a very large population, meaning a very large base of consumers, and so forth. So I think perhaps what you're suggesting, if not, this is what I'll suggest, is that if we trade with ourselves to start with, much more. For example, South Africa has a food surplus in some respects. Yet, you just go a couple of kilometers up north to a place such as, say, northern Kenya in some respects, or Somalia, and you find people dying of starvation. It's a matter of just building roads and taking that food. So if that intra-Africa trade was developed, then that will be perhaps help us to advance better. But I think this has to be taken with the fact that we still need to trade with the rest of the world. We can't avoid it. The colleague who talked about unrealistic goals, I think to some extent, yes, the SDGs and even Agenda 2063 are all unrealistic to some extent. But as Barack Obama used to say, there's hope has to be audacious. You have to have audacity of hope to put up big plans. And as someone else said, if you want to go to the moon, perhaps you need to fly to the sun. So that if you land to the moon, you say that's fine, right? You don't want to, sell yourself short. Go for big plans. And then even if you just achieve a quarter of that, that's fine. And I think the Agenda 2030 or SDGs provides a great opportunity because it helps us focus on really big issues. In fact, the document itself says it is an ambitious plan. So if you don't have ambition, we shouldn't reduce ourselves to saying, no, look, we shall not end poverty, but we shall end poverty for half the population of people in the world, So that's my thought. As with the fourth industrial revolution, my view is this: it might be important, but I think we need to focus on areas where we have gaps on the African continent. I do agree with Dr. Munya's sentiment earlier that we need to learn with the fourth industrial revolution and so forth. But I start getting this feeling that as we focus on these high-flown, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and some, esoteric terms that sound, in fact, in some respects, very scary, we're actually forgetting that we need to invest as Africa in the basics first. So first of all, we need universal education. We need to see more of our people in universities, even getting basic degrees before you start talking about this big thing, right? So my view is that, in fact, one of the areas that we might actually end up losing on is that we might start investing more in technology-related courses and forget the humanities. And yet technologies do not work on their own. We need to invest in literature, in history, and so forth as much as the fourth industrial revolution. So I think in terms of the long-term nature of the plans that we do have, I think a good example again comes from China. China has had this 100-year plan, which is actually moving on in a very good version, actually, as it were, because they think that by, and Monyaya can help with exact dates, but I think the Chinese think that by 2049, which is 100 years since the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, they will be a highly prosperous country. But now they consider themselves moderate, right? So I think we need to have these plans, but follow them through. My worry is that if you look at Agenda 2063, it is hardly 5 years since its launch, and yet it's already falling on all indicators. They have a 10-year, first plan, which is 2014 to 2044. But even now, we have not done an assessment to see where we are in terms of even just monitoring and evaluation. So I think having long-term plans, yes, but also consistently monitoring them and tweaking them and changing them and making them very dynamic so that they respond to changing circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now at 12:30, which means we are behind schedule, seriously. And this is what I would suggest, and I will let we can be democratic about it. I think we should bring up our last speaker. We should have John Stremlau give his presentation, and then we'll have one last opportunity for all sorts of a general Q&A at that point in time. Yay, nay, kill the moderator? What are we going to do? Okay, I'm agreed. Thank you. So, Professor John Stremlau. Thank you very much, Bob. Yes, thank you. So Professor John Stremlau is going to speak with us about an assessment of the legacy of the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan. John is a visiting professor in the Department of International Relations here at Wits. Thank you.
This one? Thank you, Alice. And do you want me to move over to this?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Well, okay. This is fine.
Can you see it?
It's okay? You can hear me? Yeah, fine. Okay, let me put my timer on here so Colleagues, this is a bittersweet assignment that I have drawn, and I'm grateful to the organizers for asking me to say a few words about Kofi Annan. It's bittersweet because I think he would appreciate the moment, and I would send him an email to say the good news is that this August conference decided to end with an assessment of his UN Secretary Generalship. Bad news is it was already lunch hour, and that would get a laugh out of him. And then I'd say that, well, the previous speaker was talking about the SDGs, and he'd say that was better spent, frankly. And he would like Bob's pragmatic approach to the SDGs, which are getting some momentum despite their high aspirations and all of the caveats that Bob issued. Kofi Annan, if he was one thing, was an idealist without illusions. And I'd like to say a few words, but this must be regarded as a preliminary assessment of the legacy of the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And I'd like to start with a very few quick caveats. It is obviously too soon to judge the legacy of his term as Secretary General, much less his 45 years of service to the United Nations from 1962 to 2007, or indeed his public service for 56 years, which never ended when he passed away on August 18th. And there is a worthy African custom of not speaking ill of the dead, and the dear man is only rested for such a short period that while I will criticize some of the policies as he would himself, because that was one of the endearing features of his personality, self-criticism, it is really a little hard to be too hard on him, and it's difficult, particularly for me, to have a critical perspective because we were acquaintances since the 1980s, and during most of the service, his service as Secretary General, I was here at this university and worried about a lot of other subjects locally than on the functioning of his Secretary Generalship as the UN. A fifth caveat is that, as with any leader, we can never know the null hypothesis of what would the world be like if Kofi Annan had not been Secretary General. And this is particularly tricky in the case of the United Nations, where power, as we've heard earlier, still primarily resides in states that own it. And all leaders, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, is a victim of historic circumstances. So Annan, in fact, was dealt a pretty tough hand to play. And in his case, he promoted the strategic goal of preventing deadly conflicts, especially within states. More on this later. But how can we fairly measure his success? And my last caveat is, why not have more PhD students working on the legacy of Kofi Annan? And that would give me at least the confidence that I could now offer you 5 interrelated pieces of what I think may be the legacy of Kofi Annan to consider, to criticize, and perhaps to pursue for further research. First and foremost, I do believe his Secretary Generalship advanced the principle that the UN has legitimate rights and obligations to interfere in the internal affairs of member states. We've heard a lot about the history of the UN, which was set up to prevent World War III, and we know we're in a very different era. His decade of service coincided with trying to render that more operational. But the second aspect I'll say a few words about is that he did advance and sought to advance human rights as an analytic tool for early warning and to motivate collective action to prevent and resolve conflicts within states. So human rights took on a different, more robust and important meaning to him, and that was conditioned by his previous experience, which I'll comment on briefly. Thirdly, he opened up the UN to civil society, to academics, to the public, to this kind of a meeting, which he would be delighted to know, in fact, was happening, and maybe he's watching us from somewhere. Fourthly, he believed in the principal mission of the UN has always been and must always be to prevent deadly conflicts, including within states. And finally, I'd like to say a few words about his character at the very end, if time is allowing, and the chair will allow me that, but I do know we're behind schedule. So briefly on elaborating these key points about his legacy, The first is that there is a paradox. He pushed the UN to find ways and means to intervene in the internal affairs of troubled states, yet one, as a creature of the system since 1962, he knew its limits. When he joined, there were far fewer than the 193 states. There were only 54 on the founding. So he was dealing with a lot more bosses than ever before. He recognized the supremacy of the P5. He had no choice. And he tried to work with the P5, whatever that P5 means in contemporary political terms. His greatest failures, he did acknowledge, were really before he became Secretary General in the 93-97 period when he was head of peacekeeping operations, and that includes, and most heartrending, the Rwandan genocide, the 94 genocide of 800,000, which haunted him throughout. There were the 8,000 Bosnian Muslims killed by the Serbs in Srebrenica in 95, a year later. He often explained and apologized these instances, particularly Rwanda, and tried as SG to prevent such events from happening again. The irony of his gaining U.S. backing for overriding the UN Security Council to be appointed, this was in NATO, and Boutros-Ghali was traveling, and Kofi was presented with an urgent request to approve NATO bombing in that conflict, and he did so. And that endeared him to Dick Holbrooke and the Americans wanted to see Boutros-Ghali removed anyway, and so Kofi Annan cropped up as the unlikely and important alternative candidate who would represent sub-Saharan Africa for the first time, but as a commodity that everybody knew and knew well, strengths and weaknesses. The irony of this, of course, is that as a principled man, while he saw a reason for acting in the case of Bosnia, I don't believe it was a cynical or expedient one, but that's a subject for further research. The irony is that he, of course, alienated the Americans, and particularly the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, because he was totally opposed to that reckless intervention in 2003. And it was 2 years after he and the UN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their humanitarian action, ironically lost in the shuffle of the 9/11 crisis. So the irony is that throughout he held that a government suppression of his own people threatened international stability. South Africa, of course, was the precedent for making an internal abuse of power a threat to regional peace and international security. But at the same time, his attitude toward this is what probably led to the possibility of the resolution after he left the Secretary Generalship of the Libyan intervention, which was to protect the Libyan people against the craziness of the colonel gone wild. And yet it got into a regime change, and we know the history, and David Manyai alluded to that earlier. Secondly, now, so in advancing the internal affairs concerns, he had lots of problems, and I can come back to that in questions, but I want to push on. Secondly, to his human rights interest, his ability to do as Saburo Ogata, the then head of the UN Commission for Refugees. Today's human rights abusers are tomorrow's refugees. This was not a moral imperative, it was a warning, an early warning of trouble within states. Kofi Annan knew very well that the UN Declaration of Human Rights was the weakest leg of the triad with the Bretton Woods institutions and the Peace and Security Council. But he took that very much to heart in an operational sense and sought to advance this work within states. I, as some of you know, wrote a testament to his achievements as Secretary General, and I made a great deal of attention to his 1997 speech in Harare, just months after he became Secretary General. And he went to the OAU in Harare and said, "My friends, I speak to you as a fellow African, and I speak to you from the heart. We will succeed to the extent that we embrace the primacy of democratic rule, the inviolability of human rights, and the imperatives of sustainable development." The success of the third wave, that was a democratization back then, begins with a single simple proposition, the will of the people. The will of the people must be the basis for government authority in Africa, and governments duly elected should not be overthrown by force. Then he goes on to add that I'm aware of the fact that some view this concern as a luxury of rich countries for which Africa is not ready. I know that others treat it as an imposition, if not a plot, by the industrialized West. I find these thoughts truly demeaning. Demeaning for the yearning of human dignity that resides in every African heart. Do not African mothers weep when their sons and daughters are killed or maimed by agents of repressive rule? Are not African fathers saddened when their children are unjustly jailed or tortured? Is not Africa as a whole impoverished when even any one of its brilliant voices is silenced? We cannot afford to lose one life. And he goes on and says, let's work together in this regard. He was roundly criticized by the heads of state afterwards, quietly but roundly, and they said, and I remember one being quoted by the media, that only an fellow African can get away with that kind of statement. That was in '97. But this was really the precursors to the African Renaissance and what South Africa and Obasanjo and others tried to do in forming a positive view of the continent and its incremental regional integration and development, which we see in Agenda 2063. So I see him as a real precursor to the African Renaissance, and that I think may be one of his legacies, but worthy of further investigation and exploration, whether the African Union's Constitutive Act and the African Charter for Democracy, Elections and Governance, or the APRM, are all part of his legacy. I leave to others to answer. I never asked him that question in 2014 when we last met, but I did ask him how he felt about human rights as a concern in light of what was happening in Zimbabwe. Mugabe was still there then. And he recalled that one of his last visits was to Harare, and he said to then President Mugabe, don't you think your service has been really quite remarkable, that it's time for you to bid your people farewell? And he said, my people aren't going anywhere. And Kofi laughed, but he then said, John, you know, this just shows you the tenacity of diplomacy really has to be tenacious, and that you have to approach each opportunity the best you can. So in that spirit, the third aspect of his character that I wanted to mention, a third aspect of his legacy that I wanted to mention, was the widening of the UN circle to include more stakeholders in the international community, and to do this over the 2 terms of his Secretary Generalship. What is the international community? Gro Brundtland once told me, the former Prime Minister of Norway, that the real international community amounts to about 20 states, of which South Africa, she then said, she thought was one among them, the Scandinavians and a few others who are willing to donate troops and are willing to sacrifice and are willing to give financial support for if they can afford it. But it's a very small set. And in a way, it's like the Security Council in a national political system is the 0.01% of the oligarchs who run the damn place. And then you've got 10% of the elite, like the elite in this room for the future of this country. And then you've got the majority of the people who are just trying to get along and may eventually be benefited by the strategic development goals. But what Annan wanted to see was the UN augmented by that 10%, which is the leaders of the international NGOs, of which I may reference others if time allows, but also by universities. He was a great friend of scientists and academics and wanted to bring them in. He was accessible to the media, and he always gave press conferences. People were really surprised that a Secretary General would be as accessible as he was. I first got to know him in the 1980s when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was active in the International Peace Academy, which was an NGO that was set up because the UN didn't have the capacity to do peacekeeping operations, and he wanted to have peacekeepers trained. And he was then still a younger officer on the rise to be head of DPKO, but nevertheless very active and would spend weekends and talking and being supportive and being encouraging of academics and engaging. After his Secretary Generalship, he took over the co-chairmanship of the Agricultural Revolution for Africa, AGRA, and the Kofi Annan Foundation were great contributions, and you know he was lead of the elders. So his life was a dedicated one to service. Now, on prevention, when I saw him most frequently was during the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, for which I bring this huge tome. Kofi Annan would go to those meetings, and when I would present, say, a monograph that I would write, he'd be there criticizing it, for heaven's sakes, the Secretary General, because he cared. This was on human rights, humanitarian action. I did another one on sanctions, and he was there commenting and criticizing. He wrote one of the monographs for the Carnegie Commission on toward a culture of prevention, and I just want to quickly, how am I doing here, Chair? I'm talking pretty fast, but I guess I've got not too much, 5 minutes. He talks, and I won't quote this, he talks here about structural prevention and operational prevention and links it to the UN in an analytic way, in a thoughtful way, in a way that worthy of further study and consideration by other scholars. My last 3 minutes let me take on his personal attributes or his character. In his early years, he was the son of an Akan elite in the Kumasi region of the coast of Ghana. He went to schooling in a Methodist school, got a Ford Foundation grant, Alice, to go to Macalester College in Minneapolis, and then on to the Institute of Higher Education, and joined the UN in '62, the WHO initially. He told author Philip Gorovich in 2003, quote, "I feel profoundly African. My roots are deeply African, and the things I was taught as a child are important to me as an African." That reminds me of another leader, Jimmy Carter, whose his secondary school teacher advice was, adhere to enduring principles and adapt to changing circumstances. That was really Kofi Annan. The most notable trait was a willingness to admit and learn from mistakes, and he did that at great length with regard to Rwanda. Robert Ignatieff said, despite the setbacks, Annan commanded the world stage with ease in his impeccably tailored suits, his goatee beard and his grace radiating an aura of probity, authority, perhaps gained from his depth of UN experience. Few people have spent so much time around negotiating tables with thugs, warlords, and dictators. He made himself the world's emissary to the dark side. My last quote, let me just say that on Rwanda, he knew that if Romer Dallaire, and I interviewed Dallaire about this, could have gotten 10,000 troops, which would have been very easy to do, he could have stopped the genocide. And that haunted Annan, and he talked about it at great length, and I think that's, again, a chapter that ought to get a further investigation. I had 3 or 4 personal anecdotes, which I won't take time on right now, but that relate to his character. Let me just end by quoting Jay Naidu, the founding General Secretary of CISA here in South Africa. Quote, "There walk among us those who carry a magnetism of our shared humanity and radiate that positive energy with humility and softness that engenders trust. Kofi Annan was such a person. He carried that Madiba magic effortlessly, selfishly, touching the lives of millions. I trusted him. I admired him. I saw in him a, quote, servant leader. It is a trait so lacking in global political leaders today. Thank God the organizers didn't ask me to comment on Donald Trump." Thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Thanks, John. So let's take questions at this point, specifically with regard to the presentation that just happened. And then after we do a round of questions on that topic, we can open it up more generally. And we basically should take maybe 10 minutes in total. So, questions from the floor. David.
Thanks, John, for a great presentation. Thanks, John, for excellent presentation. We used to add his view of Kofi Annan. There are a few things. Boutros Ghali is considered much more stronger, clearer and rigorous than Kofi Annan, given the fact that Rwanda happened under his watch. And the mere fact that he was also part of the insider loved by the West, and only to be dealt with towards the end, the corruption story during Bush concerning his son. I just wanted to hear your view on some of these areas. I was privileged to meet him with you, I remember, in
Norfolk
Kenya.
Hotel. I think,
Yes. So I'm more interested on the Kenyan case as well. His intervention in Kenya, I think that was a disaster in my view. I mean, he really wanted Uhuru to go to prison. He failed dismally. So I just want to hear more of this part of Kofi Annan. He was a great man, so I really agree with you in most of what you said.
Can I answer that?
Gilbert?
This is actually not a question. I was just going to comment that I was in Ghana recently, and I was questioning why Kofi Annan was buried very quickly. Because the Ghanaians usually, when you're a big person, they take almost 3-4 months. And the comment was that Kofi Annan was not a real African. That his wife insisted that he be buried very quickly, unlike the other Ghanaians.
Thanks for questions from two colleagues. Quickly to David's, that's just easier to answer than to elaborate on Gilbert's question, but I have a comment or two on that as well. Boutros Boutros-Ghali was, of course, the Secretary General when Rwanda occurred. I mean, Kofi was the head of PKO, and he succeeded Merrick Golding. It was a new bureau that to Boutros' credit, he created the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. But what Kofi explains in considerable detail and done as a memoir is the constraints that he was under. I mean, he didn't have the U.S. behind him because Clinton was spooked by Black Hawk Down in Somalia, and I think this is a terrible indictment of the U.S. in that instance. And so, you know, I wouldn't want to compare. I'd leave that to others to do, the Boutros-Ghali regime and Kofi Annan's regime. Kofi Annan knew how to get things done and get along. Boutros-Ghali ticked people off, and you can say which people and when and what issues. Those are all have to be analyzed. But I guess I would, on balance, my instincts, and I knew Boutros-Ghali much less well, that I would opt as an Annan man. Kojo, his son, may have been in an oil for food swap deal with regard to Iraq. There's so many people stewing around in that, and I don't know where the truth lied. He was exonerated. Kofi Annan was exonerated, as you know, on that issue. And as parents, we have kids, and you know, how much leeway do we leave them, and how much do we not? I don't know, so I won't comment anymore on that. On the Kenyan situation, I was going to say, geez, with Gilbert there, I'm not going to comment on whether Uhuru should or should not have gone to jail. But I do note the irony of the question, because we just running this course on the international politics of elections, and just last Friday, one of the students was talking quite glowingly of Kofi Annan's mediatory role, and I confess I haven't studied it very closely, so I don't really know. And Gilbert, as to what was happening in Accra and the funeral, we don't know very much about the circumstances in which he died. He died of a very brief illness in Geneva, and at 80, and so we don't know what the family arrangements were. I have no idea. I wouldn't trust any taxi driver on the. You're probably talking in Accra. Let me just say, though, in a passing, that the Annan Foundation was a very real and going enterprise, and it has done a lot of good work. But one of the anecdotal instances that I saw was during the very, very close 2008 election. He sponsored, his foundation sponsored presidential debates, and they were more substantive, more lengthy, more useful, and more calming to the general public who all watched television than anything I ever saw in U.S. presidential debates, at least in recent campaigns, and certainly not in 2016. So there you are. I think he was doing a good service to the country through that. And there's an awful lot of Ghanaian pride in Kofi Annan's achievement, obviously, as there should be, because enough said about he's a great man in my view, but anyway. Yeah. Oh.
Pardon
Maybe
me?
the general.
Okay, so are there any other questions specifically for John? Okay, I'm going to first go to this young lady in the back, and then I'll come to you, Bob. Maybe.
Okay, my question to Professor John. Kofi Annan is a complicated legacy of impressive achievement and some profound failures with him. But the question I want to ask is that what are the lessons that other African leaders can draw from this important historical figure to be able to address some of the challenges some African countries are going through, such as corruption, hunger, starvation in their countries, poor education, gender inequalities?
Should we take both questions?
Okay, sure.
Bob,
Thanks.
please turn off your mic.
And my question to John is, what would you say to an assessment that I've seen, feature post Kofi Annan's death, that while that he did well as, he was a great man, as David has said, he had also a weakness in management, essentially. That he used the country club management style, meaning that he was extremely loyal to his buddies, even within the UN system. So much so that he turned a blind eye to some of their failings. And therefore that the UN system became lethargic and in some areas quite non-achieving under his watch.
Yeah. That's a very good topic to research, Bob. I would hesitate, as you know, and especially at this tight time, to go into how his management style worked. I just consider the UN to be a very difficult environment in which to manage anything. And this may be relating back to what lessons African leaders could learn from Kofi Annan. I think it's a wrong question to ask, because all politics is local, and African leaders, above all, have to take care of their own backyards and learn how to lead their own countries, which in the case of most African countries which have economies the size of an American city of 50,000 people is a real challenge when you're walking on the world stage as a sovereign equal. So that it's very, very difficult to see where the transfer of lessons would be learned. I think that what Annan did was make the UN more open and receptive and responsive to input from outsiders, more of a people's UN, ironically, because he was such a refined elitist, but that, the way he carried himself and comported himself, but, it's this way he's fastidious, like Mbeki was fastidious, I guess, and in a way I admire that. Because it commands respect, and he just learns how to do that. But I think this may sound contradictory, but I think what African leaders could learn from Kofi Annan is simply the humility to admit that you're wrong when you're wrong, and to be able to see the funny side of things. The very first years I knew him in New York, we were neighbors on Roosevelt Island, and I saw him one morning in the dead of winter, and he was all bundled up, and I could barely recognize him. And I said, this is your far cry from Africa. And he said, well, when I got off the plane in St. Paul, or Minneapolis and St. Paul, to go to college at McAllister, they handed me earmuffs that I was supposed to wear, and I'm a proud African. I'm not going to put those silly-looking ears on. And he said, within 5 minutes, I learned better to cover your ears than freeze. And you know, he never lost that sort of ability to laugh at himself. One, and secondly, the other anecdote is in Liberia when he was there. My successor at the Carter Center, Jordan Ryan, was there working on some project for UNDP, and he was not with his family, and his daughter was having a birthday. And when Annan heard that his daughter was having a birthday, he stopped all the operations, got him, didn't stop all operations, but the way Jordy tells it, said, let's call her immediately and let me tell her congratulations to happy birthday. It was that human touch, you know, that I think makes him worth looking at for leaders who may feel they're a little bit too self-important. You can be proud and fastidious. And the last anecdote is that at the Norfolk Hotel, David, back when this was after you and I were there, Kofi Annan was on a Carter Center mission, and he stopped there and submitted a bill for manicure, pedicure, and other things for $300. And somebody brought it to me. He said, "We can't pay this, you know, because Carter would blow a fuse if he ever saw it. He wouldn't see it, but you know the accountants would." And so I said, "Listen, I know Kofi Annan well enough. He just did this to maintain himself when he's traveling. Don't worry about it. Just don't pay it. Just don't pay it because we can't afford to pay it, and we shouldn't pay it." And he won't ever raise it. He never raised it with him, and I never joked about it with him. But you know, it's just symptomatic of how you go along and get along in this world. And I just learned a lot about how that happens from him. I mean, I know we talked about post-colonial when we started and all that kind of stuff, but it's the personal touch that I appreciate this opportunity to talk about Kofi Annan.
Thank you very much, John. Now, Gilbert, I am going to take instructions from you.
Just 10 minutes for the general discussion.
10 minutes? Okay, here we go. Sir? And these, I mean, you need, if you have a specific question for one of our presenters, please indicate who the question is for and direct it to. And once again, identify yourself. Thank you.
I think my question goes to Professor Gilbert. And I will have maybe a small question to...
You have to be fair. There are others that might have questions, and we want to respect the time that we have.
As a VOP who works in the environment of VIPs, I would like just to ask a small question relating to Africa. Are we part of the global governance setup, or just beneficiaries or victims of superpowers decision making? That's my first small question. And the last question goes to Dr. Bob. Thank you for the pragmatic presentation on SDGs. And I have a problem with the phrase "to end poverty." It's not too ambitious. Because when we say to end poverty, it means all Africans will have meals at 12, and decent meal. In Latin, they say primum manducare. And it's like we didn't learn any lesson from Millennium Development Goals and come up with another ambitious program of SDGs. So I don't know if you can try to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Let's take one or two more questions and then have the responses, and then I think that will take us to the end of our 10-minute period. Any other questions from the floor? Sir?
My name is Francis. My question will go to Dr. Wekesa and David. The question of poverty and the question of Africa being poor, don't you think it's because of money is being banked in foreign countries? During my studies, we had an opportunity, I did my journalism in Switzerland, and we had an opportunity to go to UN headquarters in Geneva, UNESCO in Paris. And when we were in Geneva, we went to Bern, which is the headquarters of the Swiss government. And from there, you could see so many banks. And you could see that we were shown a hotel where Mobutu used to reside when he was in Switzerland, and he was paying 2,000 Swiss francs per night. So if we continue banking in foreign countries, we will surely continue to be poor. It's not that we are poor, we need to change in here, in the heads, our mentality and our perception. We don't need partners. Do we really need partners? We will need partners if we take our monies and then we bank them in foreign countries.
Any other questions from the floor before we shut down the questions and go to the answers? One last question, this is it.
No, it's not. I repeat my question. I didn't get an answer to it. Maybe another one will ask that question. Another question. It was about capitalism environment. I'm not a communist. I just want to say, is the future of our globe guaranteed within the capitalist system, which is too individualistic? Or we should be more imaginative in creating a new system? And I repeat, I'm not a communist. Thank you very much. I want an answer to that question.
And your question is directed to whom?
It is directed to Bob, Dr. Bob Wekesa. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we are now going to ask Gilbert and Bob and David to respond. Thank you.
That's a good question. Is Africa part of the global governance? And I think the response is twofold. One is yes, and that's why we are talking about Kofi Annan. We've had Africa, big leaders, big people, big Africans participating in global governance at various levels. And Africa is part of, as Dilip was talking about this morning, Africa is part of the whole infrastructure that was created in Bandung in 1955. Africa's voices are much more listened to if we work with the rest of with like-minded states. That's how we've been able to do many things globally. So we're part of the global governance because we are part of this world. And some people want to wish us out of that world, but we continue to persist that we are part of the globe. And therefore we work with all actors. But your more interesting question is that role as effective as it should be? And we've had that discussion since morning. Africa's voices are fragmented. And so we need to do more in working towards a more common African voice. This is the dream that Nkrumah gave us in the 50s. Mbeki gave us in the 90s, in 2000. We cannot afford to work apart. We have to work together. And that's how we become more effective voices globally.
Dave?
Thank you. Corruption, I think that's what I would answer to. The problem with the continent at the moment is that we tend to want to be more Catholic than the Pope himself when it comes to the question of democracy. We believe that this termism, there's just madness on termism. I think our priorities are not right. Democracy is a good thing. We need to embrace it. And this madness, it started in Kenya, now it's in Zimbabwe, that elections can only be good. John could speak better on this. Can only be democracy if your opposition win. That's madness in Zimbabwe. The shelves are empty as we speak. And you listen to Shamisa, what he's talking, he's mad. Literally mad. And to the focus we put on dictators and head of states, we seem not to put it on opposition leaders as well. That in times like this, countries such as Zimbabwe, you need to close the noise and stick to solving the problem at hand. We need pragmatism more than anything else. And lastly, Corruption. Yes, look at South Korea. Not long, the 60s and 70s. South Korea was far behind Ghana in almost everything. But today, but let me tell you, South Korea was more corrupt than Ghana. What went wrong? And I'm not saying corruption is good, but here's the reality: is that the corrupt families in South Korea, they never invested that money outside. Corrupt money, but it built bridges. Corrupt money, but it built universities. And with us, it's worse on the continent. The very same corrupt money, it's shipped out of the country. And we bring all sorts of people in terms of running our affairs. So it's just madness. So we just have to be serious and angry enough. I mean, students like you have to be mad for things to change. You are the revolutionary to stop corruption. And you know my view. Lock them up. Thank you.
I think the first question on ending poverty as being, just too much of a goal to achieve, I do agree that yes, it is idealistic, it is maybe unrealistic as well. However, as you realize in global governance and the crafting of these visionary documents, you don't usually want to say we shall end half the poverty in the world. Because then someone will quickly ask, which half of the world are you talking about? So I mean, goals are usually aspirations. Goals are ambitious by their very nature. We might not attain them fully, but it provides something, benchmark, something to look toward. So you really can't say we might. I think the people who crafted this, Agenda 2030, did not craft it with the idea that by 2030 we shall have ended all poverty. However, you don't write a goal halfway. You don't write goals in half measures. You raise them pretty high. You don't sell yourself short. If by 2030 you arrive there and you've not achieved everything you wanted to, you can then revise with a new target ahead, right? I think that's what we all do even in personal lives. When we go to school, we want to be number one in our class, from class 1. But then at the end of the time, you realize that smart kid in the corner is always coming number 1. So as you go towards the end of primary school, you revise your ambitions to say, now let me look at number 10. And then perhaps if you don't hit number 10, you say, no, look, I'll just try not to be number last. Yeah? To be the last one, right. With regards to the matter of, I think the professor there was talking about, African leaders are investing, that is capital flight essentially, and safe havens in Europe and so forth, the Ginzes and Jerseys, we know all the places where leaders steal from our coffers and they invest there. And I think something that Bonyai has just talked to now. I think that's not the only problem, in fact. The bigger context, in fact, that has informed not just the MDGs but SDGs as well, is the fact that the development is slanted against Africans and then essentially the global south. I mean, the whole big debate, in fact, is that there is a prosperous global north, which is North America, John's country, US, North America, Canada, parts of Western Europe, including the Nordic countries. And then there is an emerging number of countries, including China, India, Brazil, so forth, that are in the middle. South Africa as well. South Africa is on the lower end of that group. And then there's the poor countries, including my own country, Kenya, and the rest. So I think this is the big political, economic, and cultural debate. And it's not just capital flight that informs this. I think we know, for example, Emmanuel Wellerstein, of the political economist, who has given us the model of the center, which is America and them, the semi-periphery, which is the European countries and some of the emerging economies, and us as the periphery. So I think, and of course we all remember Walter Rodney and the whole concept of how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So I think ultimately we can, tying this to what our colleague was actually saying, colleague who said he's not a Marxist, but he's very much one. I think I can tie those two questions and say that we have two choices. Either we go the gradual approach, which is creating partnerships with the people who are stealing from us, knowingly, knowing that we can't beat them. If you can't beat them, join them. That's one approach, and this is the approach of SDGs. Or we can go the revolutionary approach. We can, take up arms and say we are gonna, eject all imperialists tomorrow, and just take over our economies and prosper as Africans. So there are these two extremes. It's a matter of choice. It appears to me Africans are not yet ready at the point where we can take a revolutionary approach a la Mao Zedong or the Cuban guy was called who again? Fidel Castro, and so forth to unite the continent against the imperial order of the West. In which case then we have no choice but to work with our exploiters, meaning that we have to create partnerships, but in a very strategic manner. I think those would be my comments. Thank you.
Great. And there's one last comment coming.
My only last comment is there's a third choice that Bob was just outlining between the two extremes, and that's contained in this document here, which is the South African Constitution. And if you want to study what Marxists and capitalists and others reached an agreement on, start with the South African Constitution.
All right. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the audience for being here and being actively engaged. I want to thank the African-China Reporting Project, the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, and the African Center for the Study of the U.S. for putting together this forum. I guess my one takeaway, if there's just one phrase from this morning's and part of the afternoon's discussion, is that, as Africa and Africans in various countries on this continent, we should have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, but only permanent interest. So with that, please join us for lunch.
Can we give Alice a hand, please? She's done an excellent job, so everybody is invited for lunch. Thank you.